In this lecture, we will continue our two-part series on data protection impact assessments. Here we are going to discuss the minimum features or sections that should be included in a DPIA. We will then discuss the term proportionality. We will look at the UKICO's diagram for completing and reviewing DPIAs. And then we have two final notes on supervisory authority and consultation. So the minimum features of a DPIA as outlined by the WP29 in their Annex number 2 are as follows: a description of the processing, the purpose of the processing, the legitimate interest pursued, for example, is it personal, commercial, or social, the necessity of the processing, the proportionality, the data subject risks, and the risk mitigations. Now, proportionality is a term that you're going to see quite often when it comes to DPIAs. And essentially, proportionality means that the processing must be appropriate and not excessive in relation to the objectives. An example of proportionate processing is direct marketing with opt-out. And so your organization is involved in direct marketing activities. You market directly to customers, but you provide them with an opt-out. An example that is disproportionate is indiscriminate data retention. For example, retaining air passenger data for 5 years. And that example of retaining that data for 5 years by an air passenger company is a real-life use case. We can see how that is disproportionate because you probably don't need to retain air passenger data for that long. You're likely to need the data prior to departure and maybe shortly after departure in case there's some follow-up that needs to be done. Maybe you need an invoice for your company, or perhaps you need to locate some lost luggage, something along those lines. But maintaining that data for 5 years seems a bit excessive. A useful diagram of the process of completing a DPIA comes from the United Kingdom's Information Commissioner's Office, or ICO. And UKICO, that's an acronym that you're to see quite regularly if you're following privacy and data protection related headlines. And I'm not going to read through the entire wheel here, but we can see that the beginning of this is at the very top. If we think about this cycle as a clock, then at the 12 o'clock is identify need. We move to the 1 o'clock, which is describe processing, the 3 o'clock, which is consider consultation, and so forth and so on. And we end with review and update. And so this is a useful way of thinking about the DPIA process. For the exam, it's unlikely that you're going to need to remember this entire process, all of the different steps, and the sequence. I think instead, this is an important reference point for your own career. If your organization conducts DPIAs now, or if you have to do so in the future, referencing this diagram, again produced by the UKICO, I think is a useful tool. Concerning supervisory authorities, each EU member state establishes their own supervisory authority. This authority is responsible for monitoring their country's GDPR application. They also have investigatory, advisory, and corrective powers. 3 prominent examples that you'll see in the headlines quite often are France's CNIL, Ireland's Data Protection Commission, and Italy's, is it Garante? I see Garante a lot. If you are Italian or speak Italian, I apologize for butchering your language. And finally, supervisory consultation may be required when there is insufficient risk mitigation. For example, you've put in place certain mitigations, but the processing remains high risk. When data access threatens data subjects' life, rights, freedoms, or economic security. When there is a loss of control over data access, for example, use, sharing, or distribution. Or there is discovery of an unpatched vulnerability that exposes a dataset to unauthorized access. In this lecture, we conclude our two-part series on data protection impact assessments. The minimum features laid out by the WP29 Annex 2 are description of processing, processing purpose, legitimate interest pursued, necessity of processing, proportionality, data subject risks, and risk mitigations. Remember that proportionality means that the processing must be appropriate and not excessive in relation to objectives. I will not go through the UK ICO diagram here, but just know that that's a useful reference for the future. Concerning supervisory authorities, remember that each EU member state establishes their own supervisory authority. This authority is responsible for monitoring GDPR application and also has investigatory, advisory, and corrective powers. Finally, supervisory consultation may be required when there is insufficient risk mitigation, when data access threatens data subjects' life, rights, freedoms, or economic security, when there is a loss of control over data access, or when there is a discovery of an unpatched vulnerability.